January 1944. Dawn spread slowly over the Italian countryside. Mist hangs low across the valley floor. Burned grass still smolders where the fighting ended only hours earlier. The silhouettes of destroyed American tanks stand black against the pale sky, twisted tracks, ruptured turrets, ammunition cooked off during the night. German gun crews move carefully among the wrecks, counting. They know this ritual well. After a successful engagement, the battlefield becomes a ledger. One officer marks numbers in a small notebook. Another studies the road leading west by every operational expectation. The armored force opposing them has been neutralized. Fuel was limited, roads were narrow. Reinforcements should take days to arrive. Then, faint at first, comes the sound. Engines, not one, many. From beyond the ridgeline, metal tracks begin clattering in steady rhythm. Shapes emerge through the morning haze. Fresh American tanks roll forward in formation, paint clean, antennas intact, cruise alert. The same unit designation appears again on turret markings already recorded as destroyed. The officers stop writing. For a moment, no one speaks, because the question forming is not tactical, but industrial. Where are these machines coming from overnight? Before the war, German military planning rested on a simple operational truth. Modern armies could not rapidly replace major equipment losses in the field. This assumption was not careless, it was based on experience. During the First World War, factories required months to manufacture artillery, vehicles, and ammunition in meaningful numbers. A successful breakthrough, therefore, had permanence. The method later described as blitzkrieg was never only about speed. It was about collapse. Armored formations were intended to destroy enemy cohesion faster than the enemy could reorganize or re-equip. Once command structures fractured and material losses accumulated, resistance would disintegrate naturally. Victory came not from occupying every position, but from making organized defense impossible. Early campaigns confirmed the theory. In Poland, 1939, mechanized columns bypassed strongpoints and shattered communication networks. Polish units frequently found themselves unable to replace destroyed guns and vehicles while retreating. Within weeks, operational resistance ended. In France, 1940, the pattern repeated on a larger scale. Allied armies possessed more tanks overall, yet German commanders observed a decisive difference. French losses were permanent losses. Destroyed equipment stayed destroyed. When armored divisions broke through the Meuse and advanced toward the Channel, French units that lost vehicles could not restore their strength quickly enough to counterattack. The lesson absorbed by the German High Command was clear. War could be decided by destroying the enemy's means of fighting. Not necessarily the enemy's manpower. This shaped every operational calculation that followed. German planners carefully estimated the replacement capacity of opponents. They studied railway throughput, industrial density, steel output, and manufacturing time. Armored warfare, in their view. Even the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 followed this logic. Despite enormous Soviet manpower reserves, German staff officers believed that massive early equipment losses would cripple Soviet operational ability before long-term industrial recovery became possible. The expectation was not that the Red Army lacked factories, but that those factories could not respond quickly enough to catastrophic destruction. The concept depended on a stable relationship between battlefield destruction and industrial recovery time. Losses today meant weakness tomorrow. Through 1941 and much of 1942, this assumption still seemed valid. When German armored units destroyed enemy formations, they usually encountered reduced resistance during subsequent engagements. Enemy recovery required weeks or months, a delay long enough for operational exploitation. German commanders therefore developed habits of measurement. After every engagement they counted wrecks, guns, and abandoned vehicles. The numbers predicted the next battle. If enough enemy armor had been destroyed, the following day's advance could proceed with confidence. This expectation became instinct. But the entrance of a new opponent into the war introduced a variable German doctrine had never confronted, an industrial system organized not for replacement over months. At first, German observers underestimated the significance. The United States was distant, separated by oceans and shipping lanes vulnerable to submarines. Material would arrive slowly, they assumed, limited by transport rather than production. What they did not yet understand was that the industrial model itself had changed. The question was no longer how long factories required to build equipment, but how continuously they could build it. And that realization would begin forming only after repeated battlefield encounters. Produced a result German operational logic could not explain: destroyed armored formations returning almost immediately. In 1940, the United States did not yet fight in the war, but its economy had already begun to reorganize for it. American planners approached mobilization differently from the European powers. Instead of expanding traditional military arsenals alone, they transformed civilian industry into military industry. Automobile manufacturers, appliance companies, steel producers, and machine tool plants were assigned standardized military contracts. The objective was not craftsmanship, it was uninterrupted flow. Factories were redesigned around continuous production. Shifts rotated without pause. Tooling was simplified. Parts were standardized so that components built in one state could fit machines assembled in another. Repair was considered part of production, not a separate activity. The result was a system where the factory did not produce individual vehicles, it produced streams. The most visible example stood in Michigan at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, designed with automotive manufacturing logic rather than traditional armory practice. The facility applied conveyor assembly to armored vehicles. Hulls moved forward as workers repeated single specialized tasks. Turrets, engines, transmissions, radios, and optics were pre-manufactured elsewhere and installed in sequence. A tank was no longer built from beginning to end by a single workforce. It was assembled from a national network. Equally important was uniformity. The United States favored fewer models produced in larger numbers. Instead of maintaining many specialized designs requiring unique parts, American planners emphasized interchangeability. A damaged vehicle could be repaired with components from any shipment. Workshops near the front did not need to wait for specific replacements, they used whatever arrived. Production speed increased beyond traditional military expectations. But the real transformation occurred outside the factory gates. Transportation was integrated into manufacturing planning. Rail schedules, port loading capacity, and cargo ship turnaround times were calculated alongside production quotas. Equipment leaving a factory already had a destination, assigned unit, and expected operational date. Spare parts traveled with the vehicles they supported. Replacement crews were trained on identical machines before reaching combat zones. In effect, the battlefield became the final stage of the assembly line. This created a new relationship between destruction and availability. A tank knocked out in combat did not represent months of lost effort. It represented a unit of expenditure, something already scheduled for replacement. When American forces began operating in North Africa and later in Italy, German intelligence initially recorded only increasing quantities of vehicles. The scale appeared large but not unprecedented. Units reported encountering armored formations that returned to full strength far sooner than expected after heavy engagements. Logistical reports intercepted by German analysts described organized depots, floating reserves offshore, and repair echelons positioned just behind advancing forces. Damaged vehicles were recovered, rebuilt, and reissued with systematic regularity. New vehicles arrived not as reinforcements but as part of routine supply cycles. The battlefield rhythm changed. Instead of decline following losses, American formations maintained consistent operational density. To German planners trained in attritional accounting, this disrupted prediction itself. Destroying a certain number of tanks no longer forecast reduced resistance the following day. The correlation between tactical success and operational advantage weakened. The realization came gradually, not from a single battle but from repetition. Again and again after engagements judged materially decisive, opposing armored strength appeared restored. The American army was not merely replacing losses. It was sustaining a constant level of equipment presence independent of daily destruction. And that meant the war was no longer governed by depletion, but by throughput. A principal German doctrine had never been designed to fight. We now move from background to perspective. Behind every American armored advance existed a layered structure rarely visible from the front. Supply did not move in a single line, it moved in waves. Forward units received fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles from intermediate depots, positioned deliberately within operational reach but outside immediate artillery range. Behind them were larger storage areas linked to ports, and beyond the ports stood a constant maritime bridge. Ships unloaded not occasional reinforcements but scheduled inventory. The key difference was predictability. Replacement tanks were not dispatched because losses occurred. They were dispatched because the calendar required them. Commanders in the field expected delivery cycles the same way factories expected raw materials. When a unit reported destroyed vehicles, the report confirmed consumption rather than triggering an emergency request. Recovery battalions collected damaged machines and transported them rearward while new vehicles moved forward along the same routes. Traffic therefore flowed in two directions continuously, repair and replacement operating simultaneously. To observers unfamiliar with this system, the results appeared improbable. A battlefield that showed clear material defeat one evening displayed restored armored presence the next morning. Yet from a logistical perspective, nothing unusual had happened. The pipeline had simply continued functioning. The front line was no longer the end of supply. It was part of it. The leadership angle, reports reaching command. German command structures relied on accurate reporting to make operational decisions. After-action summaries described numbers of enemy vehicles destroyed, disabled, or abandoned. These figures influenced planning for subsequent engagements. By 1943 and 1944, some reports began showing a discrepancy. Units described heavy armored destruction but noted that enemy strength did not decline proportionally afterward. Intelligence sections compared successive reconnaissance observations and found formations, maintaining consistent density despite recorded losses. At first, explanations focused on undercounting or misidentification. Perhaps multiple units were rotating through the same area. Perhaps earlier destruction claims were exaggerated. Verification procedures increased. Yet the pattern persisted across different fronts. Operational planners confronted an unfamiliar condition: battlefield success without strategic reduction. This forced reconsideration not of combat effectiveness but of economic capacity. The problem was no longer estimating enemy maneuver. It was estimating enemy production, transportation, and repair simultaneously. The realization developed slowly within staff discussions. Then victory through cumulative destruction became unlikely regardless of tactical performance. In practical terms, a battle won could still leave the overall situation unchanged. The psychological angle, the morning recognition, for soldiers and officers alike, war normally followed a rhythm. Engagement, destruction, recovery, advance. Each phase produced visible consequences. When that interval disappeared, the perception of progress changed. Reports described repeated encounters with formations believed previously crippled. Familiar markings reappeared. Roads thought secured required defense again. Even after successful ambush, anticipation of advantage diminished because experience suggested the effect would be brief. Weakened first. Then confidence in outcome. The psychological impact came from repetition. Not one engagement, but many. Not surprise, but pattern. Each morning that resembled the previous afternoon suggested that destruction alone would not conclude the conflict. The battlefield became a place where effort produced results, yet results failed to accumulate. And once that idea took hold, attention shifted toward larger implications, because if local success could not change the operational balance, the decisive moment would have to emerge somewhere else entirely. But only one side replaced them without interruption. The realization did not arrive in a single report. It arrived in campaigns. In North Africa, engagements often took place across open terrain where destruction could be clearly observed. German units recorded substantial enemy losses during defensive actions and counterattacks. Yet within short intervals, opposing armored formations resumed activity at similar strength. Initially, this was attributed to the fluid nature of desert warfare. Perhaps different formations were rotating through the same sector. Tactical success did not translate into lasting reduction of enemy armored pressure. The phenomenon intensified in Italy. The geography forced combat along narrow corridors of advance. Mountain roads limited maneuver, making it easier to measure the scale of opposing forces. When armored units were destroyed along these approaches, they could not easily be bypassed or replaced by alternative formations without being noticed. Yet replacement still occurred. German defensive positions overlooking road networks observed damaged vehicles being towed away during darkness while new ones advanced forward at dawn. Engagement reports written after one day became outdated by the next morning's reconnaissance. Units believed weakened resumed probing attacks, artillery coordination, and armored support almost immediately. Here, the illusion of local victory began to disappear. By the time fighting reached Western Europe in 1944, the pattern became undeniable. During the campaign following the landings in Normandy, German armored formations often achieved favorable tactical outcomes in localized engagements. American units suffered vehicle losses in confined terrain, hedgerows, road junctions, village approaches, areas where destruction was measurable and unmistakable. Yet operational advantage failed to materialize. After-action assessments predicted reduced enemy armored presence the following day. Instead, reconnaissance frequently reported renewed activity. Fresh tanks appeared with consistent markings, coordinated infantry support, and active radio communication. Even when losses were confirmed, the opposing force did not thin proportionally. This altered battlefield interpretation. German commanders began distinguishing between destruction and reduction. A vehicle destroyed in combat no longer automatically reduced future opposition. The tactical act remained real, the long-term effect diminished, the consequence appeared in planning cycles. Counterattacks designed to exploit temporary weakness found prepared resistance again. Defensive sectors expecting recovery time encountered immediate pressure. Engagement intervals shortened because the opponent's recovery interval approached zero. Combat therefore lost its cumulative character. Previously, a series of successful engagements produced widening opportunity. Now each engagement existed largely alone. A position taken might still matter, but equipment losses inflicted there did not necessarily shape tomorrow's fight. The environment created a new operational equation. The pace of replacement equaled the pace of destruction. In that equation, time ceased to favor the side inflicting losses. This became most evident during repeated localized armored clashes. Crews and officers who had personally observed the wreckage from earlier battles encountered the same type of vehicles again within a day. Not similar, the same type, same configuration, operating with intact coordination. Observation replaced theory. The battlefield had shifted from a contest of depletion to a contest of endurance against a production system. And once that understanding settled in, the remaining question was no longer whether a battle could be won, but whether winning battles still influenced the war's direction at all. Once repeated engagements confirmed that battlefield destruction no longer guaranteed operational advantage. The problem expanded beyond tactics into planning itself. German operational doctrine depended on measurable results. Every campaign plan assumed that inflicted losses accumulated faster than enemy recovery. From that imbalance came breakthrough. Even defensive operations relied on the same mathematics: delay the enemy while steadily reducing his capacity to continue. Ammunition expenditure reports grew heavier while predicted enemy weakening failed to appear. Engagement success still existed locally, yet it produced no widening effect. In practical terms, the front line stopped behaving like a line being worn down. The next attack came anyway, organized and supported. Operational tempo shifted subtly. Because decisive results could no longer be created reliably. Maneuver warfare required asymmetry. The enemy had to weaken faster than the attacker. Without that asymmetry, movement risked exposure without reward. Previously, fuel spent on an attack could yield large operational gains once enemy resistance fractured. Now, similar expenditures produce limited territorial change while the opposing force remained materially capable. A different form of exhaustion began to appear, not physical collapse, but strategic stagnation. Planners examined production intelligence more closely. Even highly successful defensive actions only temporarily reduced pressure before replacement restored it. This altered long-term forecasting. Campaign projections rely on trend lines. When attrition favors one side, time supports that side. Here, time became neutral or unfavorable. Every week preserved enemy capability while slowly diminishing available resources on the other side. The realization emerged gradually. Victory conditions based on depletion were unreachable if the opponent's production exceeded destruction capacity. Individual battles still mattered for territory and delay, they no longer determined outcome by themselves. Commanders, therefore, shifted focus toward containment and economy of force. Engagements aimed to slow advance rather than shatter it. Expectations adjusted downward, not toward surrender, but toward managing inevitability. The operational question changed from how to defeat to how long to resist effectively. Reports from the field reflected this altered tone. Success was described in terms of time gained instead of enemy eliminated. Destruction remained tactically necessary but strategically insufficient. The decisive moment of understanding was not dramatic. No single conference declared it. Instead, it appeared in planning assumptions quietly rewritten. Orders became more conservative. Reserves were guarded more carefully. Counterattacks were evaluated by cost rather than opportunity. The belief that a sufficiently effective engagement could reverse the overall direction weakened. In essence, the war ceased to be a contest where battlefield performance alone could compensate for material imbalance. Once this conclusion took hold, the nature of resistance changed. Effort continued, but expectation narrowed. The aim was no longer to produce collapse in the opponent's system, because that system demonstrated the ability to absorb continuous destruction. And from that point forward, each engagement occurred under a new understanding. The opponent's strength tomorrow would resemble his strength today, regardless of today's outcome. We now move into consequences. By late stages of the war, operational planning increasingly resembled accounting. German field commands still fought with discipline and tactical skill, but expectations were recalibrated. Yet it no longer promised cumulative advantage. Every action had to be weighed against cost because replacement no longer followed similar limits on both sides. Time changed meaning. Previously, delaying the enemy while inflicting losses improved prospects. Now delay alone held value, independent of destruction totals. Each day gained represented preservation of remaining resources rather than preparation for decisive maneuver. Defensive depth, terrain obstacles, and controlled withdrawal became central, not because they enabled counteroffensives, but because they slowed an advance that would otherwise regenerate its strength. Fuel shortages reinforced this shift. Armored movements required careful calculation. A counterattack that once aimed to break an offensive now aimed to disrupt its schedule. Even successful local actions risked expenditure that could not be restored. Meanwhile, the opposing system functioned differently. Replacements continued arriving in organized cycles. Damaged vehicles returned after repair, and new ones appeared in predictable intervals. The battlefield began reflecting an imbalance of permanence. One side's losses accumulated. The other side's losses circulated. This altered morale in a subtle but important way. The issue was not courage or willingness to fight. It was predictability. Soldiers and officers recognized patterns and outcomes. Engagement effort remained intense, but anticipation of lasting operational change faded. Success meant holding a position longer than expected rather than transforming the broader situation. Operational briefings began, emphasizing conservation. Positions were selected for defensibility rather than exploitation potential. Withdrawals occurred earlier to avoid encirclement. Engagement range was managed to reduce unnecessary exposure. The objective shifted toward prolonging coherent resistance. Mathematics governed decisions increasingly. Ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, and equipment availability determined feasible actions more than opportunity alone. Commanders calculated whether a local success justified resource loss when the opponent's material presence would soon return regardless. The front therefore stabilized not because fighting weakened, but because the relationship between effort and result had changed. A battle one could still protect a sector. It could no longer reshape the campaign by itself. This recognition produced a quieter form of realism within planning circles. The war had entered a phase where production capacity defined the limits of maneuver. Tactical skill remained relevant, sometimes decisive locally, but insufficient to alter the overarching balance once replacement outpaced destruction. And as months passed, the consequences extended beyond the battlefield into strategic expectation. where leadership confronted the implications of a conflict measured less by victories and more by endurance. As the war progressed into its final phase, the cumulative effect of uninterrupted production became visible across entire fronts. Armored formations opposing German defenses did not merely return after losses, they expanded in density. Sectors once contested by limited mechanized forces now faced coordinated advances supported by artillery, engineering units, and continuous logistical backing. The material presence on the battlefield grew steadily, not in sudden surges but in sustained pressure. Defensive planning adapted accordingly. German commanders increasingly organized positions in depth rather than relying on counterstroke. Strong points were chosen to slow movement, force redeployment, and consume time. Withdrawal routes were prepared in advance because holding terrain indefinitely required resources that could not be replaced once expended. Reports reflected a shift in tone. Earlier documents evaluated success by enemy destruction totals. Later reports emphasized duration of resistance and orderly disengagement. A position held for days was valuable even if the opposing force remained materially intact afterward. The imbalance also appeared in maintenance. Damaged German equipment often waited longer for repair due to limited spare parts and transport constraints. Workshops prioritized essential vehicles while others were cannibalized. Each loss therefore reduced available strength more permanently than before. Opposing forces, operating within an integrated supply network, returned damaged equipment to service at a rate that maintained operational continuity. Strategically, this affected planning horizons. Operations could no longer be designed around restoring parity through successful engagements. Instead, the focus became preserving organized resistance while larger political and military developments unfolded. The expectation of reversing overall momentum diminished, replaced by attempts to control the manner and timing of retreat. Yet combat itself did not become less intense. Local engagements remained fierce because each position still mattered for movement, supply routes, and civilian areas. What changed was the perceived relationship between effort and final outcome. Tactical success delayed advance. It did not fundamentally alter direction once the material disparity persisted. By the final months, the conflict's character had clarified. Industrial capacity had translated into operational continuity, and operational continuity into strategic inevitability. The opposing force's ability to absorb and replace losses prevented decisive collapse while steadily compressing defensive options. When movement eventually ceased and the front fell silent, the result reflected not a single battle's outcome but the accumulated effect of thousands, each influenced by a system capable of restoring its strength faster than it was reduced. The war ended where arithmetic and endurance intersected. We now conclude with meaning beyond events. The story of American industrial might in the Second World War is not one of sudden brilliance or individual heroism alone. It is a story of scale, continuity, and the relentless rhythm of production. Battlefields could still burn, commanders could still plan, and crews could still fight. Yet those human elements now operated within a larger framework. A framework where equipment could return to the field before the morning mist had lifted, where losses did not define operational capacity, and where time no longer amplified advantage in the expected way. This transformation redefined the nature of war. It demonstrated that an army's endurance could be as decisive as its tactical performance. What mattered was throughput, the ability to produce, repair, and sustain without pause. Even local offensives achieved, yet the cumulative effect that underpinned Blitzkrieg doctrine vanished. Operational brilliance met a new reality. Industrial systems could absorb attrition faster than they could be inflicted. It had become a contest of production, logistics, and persistence. In retrospect, these lessons extend beyond one conflict. They remind us that victory depends not only on what happens on the battlefield, but also on what happens in factories, workshops, and supply depots far from the front. Courage and skill remain essential, but without the capacity to sustain them, even the finest army can be rendered strategically impotent. And so, the war that seemed to Germanize an immediate struggle of tactics and terrain ultimately became a war measured in hours. It was a revelation that human planning alone could know. Longer dictate the rhythm of combat when industry itself fought alongside the soldiers.